You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our first guest returning to the Final Say Radio Show. Ambassador Francis Rooney served under George W. Bush at the Holy See from 2005 to 2008, and he's been on the program numerous times, and we've discussed his recent book, The Global Vatican, an inside look at the Catholic Church, world politics, and the extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See. Ambassador, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Welcome.
Thank you, Brett.
Well, you have a recent article in Time magazine, and I think you're spot on with this, and I only hope enough people are reading this and really digesting what you've said here, because it's so important. And I'm glad that the current Pope is using his soft power, as you write here, to find diplomatic means to try to encourage the Muslim world to deal with Islam and to bring it into the modern world. And I think the title says it all, really. But it is so vital to be able to combat some of the issues that we have in the various regions where Islam is prevalent, because it can't just be military actions, whether it be the United States military or along with our allies, combating this. It has to be a change in the mentality and in the mindset of the people to bring about something that'll be long-lasting and positive.
Yeah, the major emphasis of the Holy See's diplomacy in this area has been that the solution has got to come from Muslims, because it's their religion which is being degraded into a terrorist threat.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Pope has made several, the current Pope, Pope Francis, has made several trips. You talk about the recent trip to Albania, which of course was, very recently, and probably to some degree still a communist nation. But, it was an interesting discussion that he had and speech that he delivered talking about the ideas of peaceful coexistence and collaboration. And, I'm using the quote you have here, climate of mutual respect. And I think those are good phrases, because it's hard to try to encourage somebody to work with you when you're kind of going out there and lambasting them and saying it in a way that kind of will discourage them or rile them up, if you will. So I think using words of encouragement but being clear in your message is the right path, and I think he's doing a good job of that.
Yeah, the idea is to give a rationale to non-radicalized Muslims in which, under a framework in which they can speak up themselves and develop political consensus and philosophies of where their religion's going that are more compatible with the modern world.
Now, you mentioned here that the Pope is making a trip to Turkey, and in this trip and some of his future trips that he has coming up, do you have a sense that the governments of some of the places that he's visiting are cooperative in themselves, or is it more of just a handful of various clergy or organizations that seem to be receptive?
Well, he did speak at government installations in both Ankara and in Tirana, Albania. And so it shows that the government was willing to at least symbolically align themselves with the Pope. And in Albania particularly, he spoke very strongly about how the government itself is a coalition government, including Orthodox Christians, Roman Catholics, and Muslims. In Turkey, I think he spoke of the need to, by saying a prayer in the Blue Mosque, to coax them into some kind of interreligious dialogue.
Yeah, another interesting thing I take from your article here is, and the current Pope, Pope Francis, has changed direction with regards to a lot of social policy, and I suppose maybe playing towards more people of poverty, if you will. But he seems to be continuing the work of Pope Benedict with regards to dealing with this particular issue with the extremism found in Islam.
Yes, I think he is. I think he picked up where Pope Benedict left off. He waited a while to do it, and I was hoping he would weigh in a little more forcefully for some time last year, but he did, and he's actually taken things a little further than Pope Benedict when he talked about the possible application of the just war theory to confronting ISIS.
I think this is a very important thing for the church to weigh in, and I understand there is an enormous sensitivity because, it's very difficult for religious leaders to balance being a leader and at the same time not bringing up any sort of not being seen as being part of a clash of civilizations. That being said, I wanted to get your take because the Pope obviously is of Argentinian descent, and if you look at this problem that we're discussing around the world, it's also rapidly starting to creep in very, very much as part of an Iranian plan into South America, in parallel with a rebirth of a pretty strong communism in South America, both of which, of course, started and have manifested themselves as a result of Hugo Chavez. Has the Pope taken any particular notice of this and or implemented any efforts to try to counter that?
Not directly that I can see. But he's certainly used to speaking up against bad governments in Argentina, and he's been critical of the Maduro and Chavez governments in Venezuela, although I don't know that he's mentioned Iran directly. It's no secret that Iran is hugely involved in Venezuela, as they are in Nicaragua, and that those are very dangerous relationships that can't be of any good to the United States.
Yeah, I guess it scares me because I look at I think now of literally the 2 decades in maybe my teens and my 20s that I paid careful attention to what was going on and watching the Reagan-Thatcher combination sort of defeat that. And we always looked south of the border as people who, even though we haven't had nearly enough business relationships with, we both had North and South America both had a fairly strong Judeo-Christian values thread underneath them, and I worry I worry very significantly about losing that because it's very easy for us to focus on these other part of the world and forget what's happening south of the border. And again, I hope because of the Pope's homeland being south of the border that he could help become a very large voice of reason in an otherwise scary trend.
Well, that's a really good point. I hope the same thing that there are many Catholic leaders that hope the presence of a Latin American Pope will lead to a new evangelization of Latin Americans, because there have been a lot of evangelical development and things there as well. But I hope we have a similar evangelization of Latin Americans in government and politics, and that they decide they need to ask more out of their government in terms of freedom, human rights, transparency, rule of law, etc. If the Pope can help accomplish that, he will really do something for his region.
Well said, Ambassador. I want to pull you back to the other side of the planet briefly, looking at Russia. One of the ironies of Putin's positioning, not necessarily his tactics on the ground, which certainly leave a lot to be desired, but he's been trying to take a Christian-based religious moral high ground as of late. What's the Vatican's, and of course that's an Eastern Orthodox, I would think, primarily focus. What's the Vatican's position, if any, on that situation?
Well, I don't think that they're going to. I think they'll see through Putin's activities in the Ukraine. I mean, in most of the Ukraine, you have the Union Catholic Church, which is an Orthodox church, which has been under great pressure from Russia and on and off the years. And so, I think the Holy Father certainly like to protect those suffering Christians from the incursion of Russia in its basically state church.
That's very interesting. Ambassador, I want to ask you a question, and you'd raised the fact that in recent time the Grand Mufti, Abdul Aziz, who's the leading Muslim cleric in Saudi Arabia, spoke out clearly against the radicalization. And, of course, this is in response to King Abdullah's public request that some of the clerics there raise their voices on this particular issue. Have you become aware of other clerics who have also spoken out, and do you think that having one cleric such as he doing that is enough, or is it really going to take, not just the some of the main guys, but really from like all levels of, from all particular areas, but also from top down to make this message clear? And is it a sincere message?
I think it's going to take a lot of rocks tossed into the pond to fill it up and drain the water. And each one of these steps is a good step. There have been some op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post here lately by Muslims and Muslim leaders and average Muslims and just normal people on the street saying our religion is not necessarily radical. There are radicals in our religion. And the more of those people that speak up, the more people that read that, the better. And it's going to take a long time. And you look back at these movements when they play out, and you look for milestones that maybe were turning points. And I happen to think that maybe Regensburg will be one of those. Maybe some of the actions Pope Francis has taken now. Maybe the Taliban and ISIS taking this conflict to an all new level of violence and heinous behavior may be one of the turning points too, because it may be able to galvanize more parts of the world to step up, where many parts of the world have been more than willing to allow the United States and the UK to lead the fight.
Yeah, well, a lot of people who follow us on this program have brought up the fact that there have been so many times where Christians, Catholics, and people of other religions within the Middle East or Africa or other places have been the target of these acts of terrorism, and in many cases with absolute silence about the incidents. And what we saw yesterday, in recent days with this attack on the school in Peshawar, yeah. I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's horrific what went down there. And you would hope that, Pakistan and that region would respond to that. But it can't just be because, it finally happened to you. When you're a country that hosts, different minorities, you have to stand up against these brutal attacks, regardless of who it's against.
Yeah, the Middle Eastern governments have been more than willing to sacrifice Christians to keep peace. You go back into the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were tons of Christians in Iraq. There were Christians in Iran. There were Christians in the Moslems in Iran, and Jews, and obviously in Syria and everywhere else. And now they've all been run out or killed or marginalized.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing that I'm looking at, and I guess this has really bothered John and I in recent weeks, we see a lot of the member states in the European Union taking votes in their respective governments to support the idea of a Palestinian state. And I almost think it's contrary to what we're discussing here, because in both cases, in Gaza Strip and the West Bank, you have governments which are now unity government run by, what really is terrorist. Without a doubt, Gaza is a terrorist state, but the government now aligned with them should be viewed as a terrorist state. So it's hard for me to understand how we could at the same time be discussing and combating these issues, but we're also saying, hey, let's give these guys a state, because you're encouraging the continuation of this type of behavior. When, as in your experience, you've worked as a diplomat. That's the responsibility of engaging in those types of relationships to bring about change and to improve relations. And I think when you start using violence, it's the opposite, and you're not going to be able to achieve any sustainable goals. And I think Europe's making a huge mistake there.
Well, I think you make a really good point. The more that the administration has declined to pursue a diplomatic peace process like President Clinton and President Bush pursued, the more Netanyahu's hardened up to defend himself. And I think that to support a Palestinian state without supporting safeguards and architectures to preserve peace in that region, i.e., renounce violence and terrorism, accept Israel as a legitimate state. A lot of the kind of things that have been brought up as part of a comprehensive peace agreement going back to Ehud Barak in the Clinton years. You just can't look at one side of the equation and say, we're going to make Palestine a state, and that's going to solve everything.
Absolutely. Well, Ambassador Rooney, is there anything in particular that you're working on that you'd like to share with us, or any other particular issue that you think may be worth mentioning right now as we finish up our interview with you? And I'd like to give you the opportunity.
Thank you. I'm really glad you brought up about Latin America. I've been working on the next thing I'm working on now is a policy statement through a think tank that Senator Mel Martinez and I are both trustees of, to develop a comprehensive analysis of our policy towards Latin America and make some suggestions about how we might be more consistent and more effective. And it touches on some of the issues that you just mentioned. We had a roundtable in Miami just Monday with a lot of local leaders who are engaged in Latin America and foreign policy thinkers to try to get feedback about it, because they're our neighbor, and like it or not, they're a huge trading partner, and they're right next door. And when things go awry, we see what happens with the plight of unaccompanied children and all that from the failed states in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. You see the problems of the narcos taking over Mexico, and these are problems that bleed over to us, and we have to have a consistent policy to address it, which focuses on democracy building at the basic level: education, rule of law, transparency, creating institutions to nurture those types of principles.
That's an excellent point, and it seems like Iran and China and Russia do more in some of these areas than we do to encourage, change in policy. And I would argue, and I think evidence is pretty clear at this point, that we pushed so hard to deal with the drugs in Colombia, almost ignoring what was going on in Mexico, and everything has seemed to push up into Mexico and as a result, into our nation, bringing more things for us to deal with. So I agree with you completely. We should be focused on our part of the world and building out from a base and better relations economically, socially, and policy-wise. And I think having good neighbors is certainly better than having your possible enemies abroad setting up base close to home. And I think it's a lesson we should have learned by now, and we probably haven't.
Yeah, especially since the bad guys in the Middle East are recruiting in Mexican jails aren't ours.
Yeah, just another one of the things to add to a long list of our concerns, right?
Exactly, you bet.
Well, Ambassador Francis Rooney, it's always a pleasure. I'd like you to just take a quick opportunity to share your website or your social media so our listeners can follow you and keep an eye on the things that you're working on.
Yeah, I have a website called francisrooney.com, and it gives some things about the book, The Global Vatican, which continues to, I think, be relevant now, as relevant as it was last year when we published. This Pope is deploying some of the same important Holy See diplomatic initiatives and using their soft power. What we saw today with the business about Cuba is whether you agree with what they did or not is one thing, but the fact that the Holy See's deployment of soft power contributed materially to making it happen shows that they're a diplomatic force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a wonderful book, by the way. I keep it next to my desk along with a handful of others of our frequent guests who come on the program. So we do refer to it, and we thank you for the work that you've done in that and what you do on when you join us here as a guest. So we appreciate that. And we wish you and your family a very happy holiday, a Merry Christmas, and we look forward to speaking to you again, hopefully sometime early next year.
I wish you the same thing to you and your family.
Great, excellent. Ambassador Francis Rooney, of course, the author of The Global Vatican. You can pick that book up from any of the major book shops. Of course, check out his website, and you can follow the frequent articles that he puts out there. Anyway, again, thank you very much. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Brett.
Take care.